Morning, thank you. Great to be here. Nice to see so many people, and thanks to the organisers for organising such a great event. My background until 2012 was in the energy industry. I'd had mild symptoms until that point. And then April 2012, I had one disabling episode, which was the start of a progressive, rapid decline in my symptoms. I was very, very lucky. I ended up under the care of a professor at UCLH who got very, very interested in my weird symptoms. And he sat in the middle of a process, referred me out to all of his colleagues. I went through just about every department. And he ended up with the suspicion of a disease called mastocytosis, which is a proliferative disease when you have too many mast cells. Test came back negative. He was very perplexed. Luckily, with a bit of help from me and Google, I'd discovered this condition called MCAS. I gave him a couple of papers. He was very, very interested. And he went away and read all the literature he could find on the disease and diagnosed me with MCAS. I then subsequently discovered, through sort of social media and stuff, a large number of people suffering from an unusual range of symptoms, many that have been bouncing around the system for a number of years, and many of these symptoms would quite comfortably fall under the MCAS umbrella. I realised there was a desperate need, really, for support for these patients, to raise awareness, both in the patient community and in the medical community, try and set up something which would act as a catalyst to try and progress the recognition, the diagnosis and treatment of the condition, and ultimately fund research. So about a year and a half ago, a group of us set up the charity Mast Cell Action, and I am one of the trustees of it. Now, this is the culprit that is believed to be at the root of the problem. It's a mast cell. A mast cell is like a landmine. It really is just analogous to a landmine. It's part of our immune system, sits in your body tissues, it's covered in sensors. When it detects something bad, when it's working properly, it goes off, releases all sorts of different chemicals depending on what's triggered it, and those chemicals go and sort the problem out. They attack the pathogen if it's something that's going to make you ill. If you've been injured, they start to help with the wound healing process. Lots of different chemicals, and there's in fact over 200 different chemicals that can come out of a mast cell, depending on where the mast cell is and what's triggered it, and they produce lots and lots of different symptoms. Potentially many of the symptoms at the same time. It's important to note that one of the chemicals that comes out of the mast cell is histamine, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It's the classic chemical that causes allergy-type symptoms, swelling, itching, etc., and is very well known, and we take antihistamines to address the symptoms. So what is mast cell activation syndrome? I'll talk about the history in a minute, but basically you have a disease called mastocytosis. It's a well-recognized condition. It's too many mast cells. And there's a genetic mutation which is common in about 80% of mastocytosis patients, which they believe drives the proliferation, the overproduction of those mast cells. MCAS is dysfunctional mast cells. Those sensors on the outside of the mast cell, whatever regulates them, whatever sets them, has gone wrong. They start going off for all sorts of normal reasons and start to create, as you saw before, a whole range of bizarre symptoms. And you have normal levels of them, they've just gone wrong. So you can't diagnose it like you can like mastocytosis, which is hopefully one of the criteria is you can look down a microscope and see lots of mast cells. It's trickier. Interestingly, the Germans are very advanced in this field. They found genetic mutations, not so much at the KIT 816 gene, but in other areas of the gene. And the theory is that these other mutations are driving sort of regulatory dysfunction around the mast cell, and that's sort of an area of sort of promising research. A bit of history. 1991, some very switched-on doctors in the USA had a group of patients exhibiting mastocytosis symptoms. They couldn't find lots of mast cells in a number of them, but what they did do very cleverly was measure some of those chemicals that come out of the mast cells when it goes off. It degranulates, and the chemicals are called mediators. And they measured, in fact, it's not, I've got heparin, I think it was histamine and prostaglandin, and they came up with a concept that perhaps the symptoms that these guys were displaying were not due to too many mast cells, but were due to overactive mast cells, and they developed this concept of systemic mast cell disease. Fast forward to 2007, a very curious doctor, rather like the doctor that diagnosed me, had a patient who had just been in the system for years, had numerous misdiagnoses. He got very curious and on a hunch did a bowel biopsy. And it was really a very non-standard procedure for the symptoms that the patient was presenting with. He said, can you just do me a bowel biopsy and just do loads of biopsies? I want, dozens. And can you stain them for mast cells? And after a bit of argy-bargy with his path lab, they eventually did it, and everybody was absolutely flabbergasted. There was abnormal clusters of mast cells dotted around this person's gut. He thought he'd stumbled on some sort of variant of mastocytosis. The patient had an incredible response to medication targeting the mast cell, and he realized he'd discovered something likely being caused, the problem was being caused by the mast cell. 2011, a large group of world-leading doctors developed a bunch of diagnostic guidelines, which I'll talk about in a second. The disease was coded into IDC-10, that's the WHO, the World Health Organization, disease classification system in the USA last year. Unfortunately, that's specific to the USA. The UK doesn't necessarily have to follow that, but it's at least, it's a line there, it's a marker. Disease has been slow to be accepted in the UK. When I was diagnosed in 2013, the professors tried to find help. Actually, I went to America afterwards. He could find no useful clinical input from any UK clinician. So it's been slow to be accepted. There's lots of busy private clinics. There's slowly growing NHS expertise, and lots of doctors are thinking they're seeing it and are looking for help, to be honest, and are struggling because there's a small number of doctors that are prepared to deal with this and a large number of doctors looking for doctors to help them. Diagnosis. Well, getting a diagnosis is controversial and it's challenging, and you will not get many NHS doctors that will give you a diagnosis. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. There's no single test or examination or clinical presentation which you can definitively use to diagnose MCAS. Alzheimer's and IBS are, a diagnosis of exclusion as well. In that situation, that panel of international doctors come up with a set of rules to start to help categorize a patient so they can be consistent in the diagnosis, create a cohort, etc., for research purposes. They developed three steps there, really. It looks very simple, but every step is a subject of great debate and controversy. The range of symptoms. Well, first of all, it takes somebody to take a detailed symptoms history for symptoms covering many body systems. And many of you, I'm sure, will have lots of experience of talking to a dermatologist, and really he focuses on the skin symptoms. You talk to a rheumatologist or a cardiologist or whatever, and they all focus on their own symptoms. And it's very rare to find a doctor that will, with equal weight, listen to all symptoms and think about the problem. So that's tricky to find someone that will do that. And also the range of symptoms is very wide and it's debated. Luckily, there was a paper last year by the NIH in the USA which started to bring together or force agreement or whatever, bring a convergence of a range of symptoms that link the allergy, the gut, the connective tissue and autonomic dysfunction. And they found a genetic linker between a whole cohort of patients that had those symptoms. I think that paper was a milestone in starting to bring together the two ends of the spectrum and what does this disease look like. The second bit of the criteria, diagnostic criteria, this is trying to find some of these chemicals that the mast cell releases. Now, measuring chemicals in the body is a nightmare. These chemicals are transient. They degrade with heat, they get metabolized, they might not get in the bloodstream from where, the point source where they were released. They're very, very tricky. There are new tests on the NHS for the same two tests they used way back in 1991, histamine and prostaglandin. They're out this year, and the PDF about those tests is on our website. They're not reliable. None of these tests are reliable. So the clinical presentation is critical. Getting somebody that believes, in this disease and is prepared to take a clinical symptoms history is important. The tests are a good backup, and they start to give doctors confidence in the diagnosis and indeed the presentation. I quickly mentioned tryptase here. Tryptase is a hotly debated mediator. It's very specific to the mast cell, but I think most doctors are, certainly overseas and in the literature, are really coming to the conclusion that it's a very poorly understood mediator. 20% of mastocytosis patients have a normal tryptase. I think the majority of anaphylaxis patients have a normal tryptase. Anaphylaxis is typically recognized as an allergic reaction. So there's a lot of, it's just poorly understood. I think and hopefully fewer and fewer UK doctors will discount MCAS on the basis of a normal tryptase. The third element of the diagnostic criteria is response to treatment. Some people respond remarkably well to treatment, about a third, I'd say, and they can really have quite a normal life. And, as long as they take their antihistamines and whatever else it is, mast cell stabilizers, particularly if they manage their diet, they can really respond well. Other people take a lot longer and find they don't respond so well. Some people react to the colorings and fillerings in the medication and have a real problem trying to find medication that they can tolerate. Compounding medication, which is widely available in, I think, all the other developed countries in the world, doesn't seem to be available in this country. I've tried months and months trying to get compounding for some of our patients and struggle. So it looks simple, but very tricky, and indeed quite controversial. But it's worth the effort, because many of these patients suffer enormously problematic symptoms, and they simply spend years bouncing around the system and absorbing enormous amounts of costs. So it is actually worth the effort. Treatment. Key point, and I think the previous speaker mentioned it, avoiding triggers. The mast cell's gone wrong, it starts to react to all sorts of abnormal things. And we have people, one of the kids in our group, vibration. And there is a condition called vibratory urticaria, where it's recognized that vibration gives you, itching and rashes. So physical triggers, obviously things that you eat and consume, environmental triggers, smells, you name it. There's an enormous number of things that people can react to. A key thing here is joining a patient group. We've got 2 patient groups, one for adults and one for parents of kids with this, and learning from people's experiences. Lots of parents in our group spent years, their children were reacting as babies and they didn't understand what was going on. And over the years, they've worked out what their children are reacting to. So you can learn from other people's experiences and accelerate your learning. Taking a diary obviously helps as well. If you try and track, a reaction to whether you've been somewhere or consumed something, that is enormously helpful. Medications to mitigate the effects of the chemicals that come out of the mast cells and indeed to stabilize them. There's a whole range of medications. Antihistamines are the simple starting point. H1 and H2, often in stronger doses than perhaps normally used. There's drugs which stabilize mast cells. Sodium chromoglycate is a well-known one, particularly for gut symptoms. There's ketotifen, which is another one which is widely used in the patient community. Anti-inflammatory drugs, steroids. People have lots of gut problems. The kids particularly have reflux badly, so then things like omeprazole. Adrenaline, auto-injector pens. This disease seems to be getting worse as it passes through the generations. In our patient group, we have a lot of mums with milder symptoms and kids with really, really bad symptoms, often from birth. So quite often the kids have syncope, they collapse. I don't know whether it's autonomic or, listening to Leslie's presentation, it's very interesting to see the range of things that can do that. A heck of a lot of them have EpiPens. They also suffer from throat swelling, tongue swelling, mouth swelling, difficulties in breathing as well. But an EpiPen is quite a common medication that people use. And incidentally, the prescription rate of EpiPens has gone up, I think it's 5 times in the 10 years to 2012. So something is going on out there if the prescription levels of EpiPens has gone up 5 times. Diet. And diet, I think, is a very underappreciated tool in the NHS toolkit. Some of the people find enormous benefit from managing diet, whether it's an exclusion diet, trying to figure out what might be triggering your symptoms, a sort of pseudo-allergy diet where you're taking out, additives and salicylates, low histamine diet. Some people do really well on that, where they start to take out histamine. I think depending on your symptoms and I'm guessing the mechanism of whatever's going on, different diets seem to work for different people. An exclusion diet seems to be obviously important, particularly when you've got small kids and trying to figure out what they're reacting to. There's a little bit of advice there on the NHS. I think Manchester University has a pseudo-allergy diet sheet for helping managing, I think, urticaria. But there's a lot of online resources. I think the Australians have got some fantastic doctors dealing with this area. And indeed, in our patient group, there's lots of people that have tried different diets from some very good online resources, hospitals overseas. The previous speaker, Leslie, mentioned about anxiety. Anxiety, obviously, when you get ill, you become anxious. You don't know what the course of the disease is, perhaps. It puts a strain on families, resources, financial, etc. It's natural to become anxious. This disease takes that to a whole new level. The chemicals that mast cell releases, some of them are neurotransmitters. They are like high-octane fuel on the systems and things in your body which control your moods, emotions, and anxiety is one of them. I know because I suffer from this. I can get a rumble in my abdomen. I'll get all sorts of funny sensations, and like a switch flipping, I could speak properly, I become anxious. It's like somebody has injected me with something. So it's really important to try and control that baseline level of anxiety that might be there, the normal anxiety, if you want to say, call it like that, that might be there. So things like, mindfulness, CBT, hypnotherapy, I found really, really amazing. Breathing exercises. Before I became ill, I used to be big into yoga. Breathing exercises are phenomenal. All of those things, if they can reduce your baseline level of anxiety, are really helpful. I was talking to the lady outside, the occupational therapist. Hobbies, crafts, interests, things that take you, out of that worrying world that you found yourself in, into, that dream world of engagement in a hobby or craft, or doing something with your hands, whether it's the gardening. All of those things are really, really important, and they're not you being labelled as, oh, it's all in your head. They are genuinely really powerful tools to just help deal with the mental, if you like, anxiety effects of this disease. I mentioned earlier on that it's a trial and error approach. It takes time and effort, and again, it doesn't sit naturally with the NHS processes. You need to find a doctor that is really interested and is prepared to invest time and effort in running through different medications. I'm sure all of you are well aware of the experiences that people with non-specific, slightly unusual symptoms can go through in the health system. It's a subspecialist world. People look at their area. They don't try and diagnose you. What they do is discount their area of speciality. It's understandable. It's time constraints. It's pressure. It's the way the system's set up. It's immensely ineffective at picking up these unusual diseases. I mean, another statistic, there's different papers, but typical number is 20% of people turning up at primary care do not get a diagnosis. So that's people turning up at the GP or an A&E typically do not get a diagnosis. And I suspect many of them are repeat people, like I was for many years, that just go round and round, going backwards and forwards to these people. And that's 20%, that's 1/5 of all patient attendees. It's a massive cost. The one point I'd make on this slide is that paediatrics, the situation is absolutely horrendous. I think this disease is becoming more common, and I think it's, as I mentioned before, impacting children more worsely. I don't know, bad English. You know, it's really hitting them badly. Pediatricians don't know what to do. They're struggling to deal with it. And it's very often left to the families, the support groups, to try and pick up the pieces. But there is a bubble here that's going to burst in the pediatrics world, because I know there's lots and lots of kids just bouncing around the system with all sorts of unpleasant things happening. A group of us started the charity because we realised that there is just a mountain to climb. And obviously the EDS group is completely inspirational, and the other charities are completely inspirational in what they've done. And I would really emphasise the power, the gift is in the patient community to drive these things forward. Without the patient community, things will go at a fraction of the rate they would otherwise. So get engaged, you know, if you're, in whatever way you can, whether it's responding to surveys, helping out, donating, giving your story, etc., etc. There is something that everybody can contribute, and I really would say the gift is it's in our gift to actually take this forward and accelerate the process. That's my last slide, but one thing I'll quickly mention is a plug for my dog, Bonnie. Just to go out on a high note, we've got a fundraiser on at the moment. It's called 500 Legs Walking. One of our trustees is walking the length of the Thames. That's from the source in Wiltshire down to the Thames barrier. He's doing it in 15 days with 15 different dogs, a different dog every day. And he's asking other people to, you know, he's trying to stimulate interest and get other people to do walks. Well, Bonnie's only 6 inches tall, so I reckon a 20-mile walk down the Thames was equivalent to 100 doggy miles. So that's her in training, and we did a walk. We did 10 miles the other weekend from Teddington to Hammersmith, and we're doing the second stretch, Hammersmith to Putney, on the weekend, the 14th and 15th of October, and she's on BT My Donate, and if you search for Bonnie Paling, you can find her.
Thank you, Gawain.